Welcome to America's Fractured Politics. Anyone who treats the Supreme Court's narrow rulings on National Guard deployments and possibly emergency tariffs as proof that the system is working is confusing a late nervous tap on the brakes with an actual guardrail. The truth is uglier. Institutional resistance in Trump's second term is real, but it is brittle, reactive, and wholly dependent on whether voters change who holds power in Congress and the states in 2026. Not on whether John Roberts develops a queasy stomach at the 11th hour. Here's the hard part to say out loud. If your plan for surviving an authoritarian-minded president is what for the Supreme Court to get uncomfortable, you don't have a plan. You have a prayer. And the people currently testing the boundaries of our system know that very well. They know the court moves slowly, that it hates broad rulings, that it prefers technical fixes to structural lines in the sand. They know that if they act fast enough, ruthlessly enough, the justices will be left to issue elegant opinions about abuses that have already served their purpose, and in some cases quietly morphed into new forms the court hasn't caught up to yet. Take the National Guard cases. In December, the court refused to greenlight Trump's plan to federalize Guard units and send them into Chicago as part of his immigration crackdown, leaving in place lower court orders that blocked deployments to Illinois and inspired similar resistance in Oregon and California. On paper, it looked like a rebuke, a conservative court telling a Republican president that he had failed to identify a source of authority for turning state-controlled troops into a domestic occupation force whenever Fox News screamed about crime. In reality, the ruling came after months of on-the-ground deployments in other cities, after the political theater of soldiers in American streets had already done its work, and the justices made clear they were not issuing a sweeping verdict on presidential power, just a narrow, case-specific warning that this particular theory went too far for now. Imagine what that looked and felt like in the communities that had already seen troops roll through. The night the court's decision dropped, the chyrons say Supreme Court blocks the pre-Trump Guard plan. Pundits talk about a major check on executive authority, and law professors debate the fine points of federalism. But the parents who spent the summer explaining to their kids, while soldiers were stationed at the end of their block, the activists who had to march past Humvees to reach a protest, the local officials who had to beg for basic respect for their jurisdiction, they know the truth. The court did not spare them anything. It arrived after the fact to say, next time, maybe don't do it quite like that. This is not a guardrail. That is a liability disclaimer. It is the court saying to the political system, we're not endorsing this, but we're also not going to stop a president from trying it again under a slightly different pretext, with slightly different paperwork. If you are waiting for that kind of institution to save democracy, you are asking a group of people who measure time in decades to solve a crisis being driven by people who measure time in news cycles. The same dynamic is playing out on tariffs. Trump has treated the International Emergency Economic Powers Act as a magic wand that lets him slap double-digit levies on almost any country, for almost any pretext, and call it national security. The statute was supposed to be about genuine emergencies. He has turned it into a standing authorization for economic blackmail. The court has finally agreed to scrutinize whether his so-called Liberation Day tariffs and a sprawling web of duties on allies like Canada, Mexico, and the European Union actually fit within the statute, even as importers bleed billions a month under a regime that functions as a tax on American consumers and producers. If the justices do the bare minimum and rein him in, it will come after a year of economic distortion, retaliatory threats, and presidential blackmail. Trump already openly dangling another round of tariffs against European NATO partners over Greenland and other grievances, while his Treasury Secretary goes on television to predict the court will blink. Think about that dynamic for a second. The executive branch is openly gaming out the court's weakness in public. The message from the White House is not, we will defend the legality of our policy and accept the court's judgment. The message is, we will get everything we can get out of this power while we still can. And if the court eventually narrows it, we will treat that as just another data point in the next round of escalation. The court, meanwhile, acts as though this is a normal separation of powers dispute between co-equal branches that share a basic commitment to the system. It hesitates to draw bright lines. It searches for narrow compromises. It tries not to politicize itself, without recognizing that the refusal to draw lines is itself a political choice in the face of a president who is determined to find and cross every line that remains. This is what resistance looks like in 2026. Judges and justices yanking the leash only after Trump has used the power in question for maximum political effect, and only where his lawyers were sloppy enough to leave a doctrinal opening. It is meaningful that the court refused to endorse the idea that a president can conjure an insurrection in Illinois out of immigration protests and send in troops on his own say-so. It would be meaningful if the justice put real limits on his ability to declare permanent economic emergencies and rule the global trading system by decree. But none of this changes the basic reality that Trump has learned two lessons: push as far as possible, as fast as possible, and treat any eventual court loss as a green light to reroute his agenda through different statutes, different agencies, or different forms of brute force politics. From his point of view, a loss at the Supreme Court is not a defeat. It's a tutorial. Try to federalize the Guard this way and you get slapped down? Fine. Next time, lean harder on friendly governors to volunteer their troops, or expand the role of federal tactical units that never require state sign-off in the first place. Overreach with IEEPA on tariffs and get narrow? Fine. Next time, bury the same policies under a different national security authority, or break them into smaller, harder-to-challenge pieces. The court writes opinions. He writes workarounds. Meanwhile, the other so-called guardrail that pundits cling to, elite Republican discomfort, is a mirage. Yes, some GOP donors and congressional lifers are mumbling off the record about the risks of all-out trade wars, of televised troop deployments gone wrong, of another January 6th-style meltdown if Trump tries to hardwire himself into power. Yes, a few Republican-appointed judges have balked at being turned into rubber stamps for whatever fever dream the White House cooks up next. But when it matters, when the question is whether to confirm another loyalist, ratify another hard-right lower court nominee, or quietly help redraw a map that stacks the House in Trump's favor, the party falls into line. Think about how many times you have seen this movie. A leaked quote from a senator calling the president reckless, a donor saying anonymously that the tariffs are bad for business, a retired general lamenting after his pension is secure that the deployment of troops to American cities made him uneasy. Then watch how they vote. Watch which judges they confirm. Watch which bills they block, which oversight powers they weaken, which voting rights protections they filibuster. Their discomfort is a branding exercise. Their votes are the real product. And if you want to know what they care about most, follow the maps. Look at where the real action is heading. The maps. 2026 could be defined as much by mid-decade redistricting as by any headline-grabbing scandal in Washington, with Texas's summer map rewrite orchestrated under White House pressure, triggering a scramble of retaliatory withdrawals in multiple states. Republicans are chasing additional safe seats in states like Texas, South Carolina, and Alabama, pushing maps that dilute black and Democratic voting power, while Democrats eye Virginia and Maryland as opportunities to claw back terrain before November. Hovering over all of it is yet another Supreme Court case that could force states like Louisiana to adopt race-blind maps, a sanitized phrase that often translates into erasing the political power of communities of color under the banner of neutrality. This is where the abstraction of institutional resistance collides with the concrete reality of power. You can have a court that occasionally says no to the president on a discrete issue, but if the House is locked up by engineered majorities, that court is operating in a vacuum. You can have a few Republican judges who narrow an executive power here or there, but if the state legislators are gerrymandered into permanent minority rule, those judges are operating in a world where the underlying political incentives never change. A president who knows the maps are rigged in his favor can treat every brush with the court as a cost of doing business, because he knows the chamber that might otherwise rein him in, the House, is insulated from public backlash by lines drawn in a back room. This is not an academic fight. The House map that emerges from this trench warfare will determine whether there is any check at all on Trump's next round of power grabs, whether there is a chamber that can investigate National Guard abuses instead of cheerleading them, that can legislate real tariff constraints instead of rubber stamping them, that can shore up election law instead of shrugging when the president tries to bend it. The same is true in the states, where control of legislatures and governorships will decide who oversees elections, who certifies results, who signs over vetoes, future gerrymanders, and who commands the guard units Trump keeps trying to federalize. If you want to understand how fragile our so-called guardrails are, picture election night 2026. On one screen, you have the results, a handful of key House races in swing districts, governor's mansions flipping or holding, Secretary of State races decided by a few thousand votes. On another screen, you have the Supreme Court docket, cases about tariffs, about maps, about the outer edges of executive power. The story most people will hear is about that docket, about the court standing up or caving, about whether John Roberts is worried about his legacy. But the story that actually decides how much those cases matter is on the election screen. If the House flips, if key state offices flip, then the court's cautious pushback becomes one piece of a broader structure of resistance. If the House stays in Trump's hands, if the maps lock in minority rule, then even the bravest court opinions will land like pebbles on concrete. So when pundits reassure the public that the Supreme Court stood up to Trump on the guard, or will surely moderate his tariffs, they are selling a dangerous fairy tale about how power works. The justices are not a deus ex machina swooping in to save democracy. They are one set of actors in a larger system that only bends toward accountability when the political incentives change. As long as Trump's party believes it can lock in minority rule through aggressive gerrymandering, voter suppression, and judicial capture, the court's occasional flashes of independence will remain just that, flashes, not a firewall. And here's the part that makes people uncomfortable, because it shifts responsibility back onto all of us. The only meaningful guardrail is power changing hands. That means flipping the House so there is at least one institution in Washington that does not answer to Trump's whims. It means winning state races where the outcomes decide who draws the next map, who runs the next election, and whether the next attempted abuse of emergency powers runs into a wall of defiant governors and attorneys general or a red carpet. It means treating every competitive district in 2026 as a referendum not on Trump's personality, but on whether the country wants a government where the only check on a president's appetite for power is a faint hope that a handful of conservative lawyers in black robes might someday feel uncomfortable enough to say no. If that is the best the system can offer, then the system is already telling voters the truth. Do not wait for John Roberts' conscience to save you. Replace the people who are handing Trump the levers in the first place, or get used to watching those rare flashes of institutional resistance flicker and die, one emergency at a time. The choice is not between a heroic court and a failed one. It is between a democracy that still believes in its own agency and a public that has outsourced its fate to 9 cautious aging lawyers who have already shown you exactly how far they are willing to go, and more importantly, how far they are not. This has been America's Fractured Politics. Please keep up the fight